The morning Abraham Ramsey rode onto the Holloway ranch. The sky above the Texas Panhandle was the particular shade of burnt amber that made even a seasoned cattle buyer pause and look up, as though the heavens themselves were trying to say something worth hearing. It was the spring of 1878, and the land stretched out in every direction with the kind of stubborn, windswept indifference that broke weaker men, and only deepened the resolve of the ones who chose to stay. The grass had greened up just enough after a hard winter to give the pastures a hopeful look, and the cattle that moved through the rolling plain were fat and slow, and worth every cent Jennie Holloway was asking. Abraham had heard about the Holloway herd from two different men in Amarillo, both of whom had said, in slightly different words, that the woman running that operation was not someone you tried to negotiate down without coming prepared. One of them had laughed when he said it, and Abraham had taken that as either a warning or an invitation. He was not entirely sure which it turned out to be. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that came from years of actual work rather than posturing, with dark hair that curled at the temples when the heat got bad and brown eyes that carried the particular steadiness of a man who had learned to read weather, animals, and other people with the same patient attention. He wore a plain gray shirt, dusty from 2 days of riding, and the kind of boots that had seen genuine miles rather than a single season of careful use. He had a reputation in the Panhandle for being fair, for following through on exactly what he promised, and for being, as one rancher's wife had put it with some amusement, almost startlingly quiet for someone who so clearly had opinions. He tied his horse at the fence post nearest the main house and stood for a moment taking in what he saw. The Holloway place was not the grandest ranch in the county, but it had the look of something that was being held together by genuine competence rather than just money. The fences were tight and well-mended. The barn doors hung true. The water troughs were clean. The yard between the house and the outbuildings had been swept, which was the kind of detail that told a person a great deal about who was in charge. He had taken maybe 3 steps toward the house when the door opened, and Jennie Holloway walked out to meet him. She was 27, though she carried herself with the settled authority of someone 10 years older, and Abraham noticed immediately that she did not wait to see who he was before she came forward. She simply came out, assessed the situation, and moved toward it. She wore a plain cotton dress in a faded blue that the sun had done its work on, a leather apron over the front of it, and boots that were as worn and honest as his own. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up in the practical way of a woman who did not have time for it to be any other way, though a few pieces had escaped near her temples. She was not delicate. She was something better than delicate. She was real in the way that the land around her was real, with a kind of presence that didn't apologize for itself. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, and her voice was low and clear, carrying without effort across the open yard. "I got your letter. You're a day earlier than I expected. The weather cooperated," he said. "I hope that's not an inconvenience." She looked at him for a moment in a way that felt like she was taking inventory. "I suppose it depends on whether you're reasonable," she said. "You want to see the cattle first, or you want coffee first?" "Coffee," he said, before he had quite decided to say it. Something in her expression shifted barely in what might have been approval. "Then come inside," she said. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something with cinnamon in it, and there was a girl of about 8 sitting at the table drawing something onto a piece of paper with a stub of pencil. She looked up at Abraham with the open, unworried curiosity of a child who had been raised around people coming and going. "This is my daughter, Clara," Jennie said, setting 2 cups on the table with the efficiency of someone who had done this motion approximately 10,000 times. "Clara, say hello to Mr. Ramsey. He's come about the cattle." "Hello," Clara said, and then looked back at her drawing without ceremony. Abraham sat down across from the child and looked at her drawing. It was a horse, rendered with surprising accuracy for someone her age, all 4 legs accounted for and going in the correct directions. "That's a good horse," he said. Clara looked up again, reassessing him. "It's red fin," she said, as though this should mean something to him. Is Redfin yours? He's the ranch's, she said. But he likes me the best. Clara, Jennie said, with the mild tone of a woman who was not genuinely warning her child so much as acknowledging that the conversation had a limit. It's true, Clara said, but she said it quietly to herself. Abraham found that he was already almost smiling, which was not typically something that happened to him before the coffee was even poured. Jennie sat down across from him and set the coffee pot between them. She folded her hands on the table in a businesslike way and looked at him directly, and he noticed that her eyes were the color of strong tea, the kind that looked nearly brown in some light and something close to amber in others. She had a small scar along her left jaw that was old enough to have faded to white, and a few faint freckles across her nose from sun exposure that she had clearly never worried about. So, she said, what do you know about my herd? I know you have 60 head of longhorn, he said. I know they wintered well, which means you worked hard or you planned ahead, or both. I know you're asking $14 a head, and the man in Amarillo who sold me your letter said that was non-negotiable. He was correct, she said, without any particular drama about it. I'm not here to negotiate, Abraham said. I came because the price is fair and the reputation of the herd is good. I deal in straightforward arrangements, Mrs. Holloway. Something moved across her face then, brief and controlled. It's Miss Holloway, she said. Or Jennie, if you'd rather. I've been a widow 3 years. I find the missus still catches me sideways sometimes. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it in the quiet way of a man who did not say things just to fill space. Thank you, she said simply and picked up her coffee. They sat in a companionable silence for a moment that was easier than it had any right to be between two people who had been strangers 20 minutes ago, and then she set down her cup and said, Tell me why you need 60 head. Most buyers come for 10 or 20. It was a good question, and he liked that she asked it. I'm building a stock operation east of Tascosa, he said. I've got pasture for 200 head, a solid foreman, a good well, and a contract with a buyer in Kansas that I need to fill by September. I've been buying smaller lots across the Panhandle. Yours is the last piece. She was listening in the way that people listen when they were actually thinking rather than just waiting to speak. You're assembling the herd gradually, she said. That's a careful approach. It's the only approach I know, he said. She looked at him for a long moment and then she nodded once, as though confirming something to herself. All right, she said. Drink your coffee, then I'll take you out to see them. The cattle were, Abraham thought as he walked the pasture fence line beside her, exactly as described and better in person. They were deep-bodied animals with good structure and the particular look of livestock that had been kept by someone who cared about the outcome. He watched them with the practiced eye he had developed over years of this work, and what he saw told him that whatever else was true about Jennie Holloway's situation, she had not let the difficulty of running a ranch alone compromise the quality of what she produced. Your bull, he said, watching a large roan animal move through the grass at the far end of the pasture. He's something. Goliath, she said, and the way she said it contained a complicated mixture of pride and something like exasperation. He's the best thing my husband ever bought and the most aggravating animal on this property. He cleared a fence last fall that I was sure would hold him for another 10 years. Did he go far? 3 miles, to the Pearson place. They have a neighbor's bull, and apparently the two of them had some kind of disagreement that I was not informed about in advance. She paused. We resolved it. Abraham looked at her. How? I rode over there with 2 of my hands, a length of rope, and a great deal of patience, she said. And I brought him home. She said it matter-of-factly, but there was something underneath it that he recognized as the quiet pride of a person who had handled a ridiculous situation and come out the other side of it with her dignity intact. He found that he was genuinely smiling now, which was still unusual for this early in a transaction. They walked the entire perimeter of the grazing pasture over the course of an hour, and the conversation did not flag the way business conversations usually did when the business part was finished. She asked him questions about the route he was planning to move the herd, and they were good questions, specific and grounded in knowledge of the actual geography. He asked her about her breeding program, and she answered with the kind of detail that told him she had thought about this carefully over a long period of time. Somewhere in the middle of it, they stopped walking and stood leaning against the fence rail in the afternoon sun, neither of them in any particular hurry to stop. "You've been doing this since your husband passed?" he asked. "Since before," she said. "Thomas handled the finances and the selling. I handled everything else. When he got sick, the division shifted." She looked out at the cattle. "By the time he died, I was already running it. I just had to stop pretending otherwise." "That must have been hard," he said. "Grief is hard," she said. "The ranch was what saved me from it, honestly. You can't spend too much time being heartbroken when you have 60 animals that need feeding." He thought about that. "I can see that," he said. "Do you have family?" she asked, and the question was genuine rather than polite. "A mother in Missouri," he said. "A brother who works for the railroad. We write letters." He paused. "I've been on my own out here for 6 years. Came for work and the work kept expanding and I never found a good moment to leave." "There isn't one," she said. "The land doesn't give you good moments, it just keeps going." He looked at the way the afternoon light was slanting across the grass, turning everything a burnished gold. "Is that something you mind?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, which he was beginning to understand was her way with questions she thought deserved consideration. "No," she said finally. "I think I'd be worse off somewhere that didn't require this much of me. I don't do well with too little to do." "What do you do?" he asked. "With the parts of the day that are quiet." She looked at him sideways with what he was starting to recognize as a careful kind of regard, as though she was deciding how much of herself to show him. "I read," she said. "Whatever I can get. The general store in town gets newspapers from Fort Worth and occasionally from further east. I read those until they fall apart. I have about 40 books and I have read each of them at least twice." She paused. "And I write letters, long ones. To my sister in Tennessee who thinks I'm out of my mind for staying here, and to a friend in Austin who is equally perplexed." "Do you ever think they're right?" he asked. "About me being out of my mind?" She almost smiled. "Frequently." "About the staying being wrong?" "No." They stood there for another moment and then she said, "You should stay for supper. It's a long ride back to Tascosa and the sun will be down before you're halfway there." He knew this was true. He also knew that the proper, sensible thing was to finalize the transaction details, arrange the transfer date, shake hands, and ride out before the day got any later. He knew both of these things with equal and complete clarity. "I'd be glad to," he said. Supper was beef and roasted root vegetables and cornbread that Clara had apparently been involved in making, based on the way she watched him eat the cornbread specifically with an expression of intense proprietary interest. He told her it was excellent, and her pride was so transparent and genuine that Jennie laughed, which was the first time he had heard her really laugh, full and unguarded, and it was the kind of laugh that changed the shape of a room. There were 2 ranch hands who came in from the bunkhouse and ate at the far end of the table, men named Cody and Pete, who were respectful in a way that told Abraham they had good reason to respect the woman they worked for. Cody was weathered and silver-haired, and had the easy competence of a man who had been doing this particular work for 30 years. Pete was younger and quieter, and clearly took his cues from Cody in most things. Abraham helped clear the table, which seemed to mildly startle everyone present, and then Jennie sent Clara to bed, and the ranch hands retreated to the bunkhouse, and Abraham and Jennie ended up on the front porch in the last pale light of a Texas spring evening, 2 cups of coffee between them, the conversation still going. It had moved through the cattle market and the particulars of Kansas buyers and the relative merits of different routes through the Panhandle. It had moved through books, specifically through a novel they had both apparently read in different years with different reactions, which led to a genuine and energetic disagreement that Abraham had not had about a book in years, and had not known he missed. It had moved through the winter just past, the spring that was coming, The particular way the land around them changed its character from month to month in ways that required its people to pay attention. The sun set in the west in a slow, spectacular fashion, the kind of sunset that the Texas Panhandle produced as though it were making a point. Orange and rose and deep violet, the clouds lit from underneath, the last light going long and horizontal across the grass and turning everything it touched into something that looked almost mythological. Abraham looked at it and then looked at Jennie, who was looking at it too, with the expression of someone who had seen this thousands of times and still found it worth looking at. "I should go," he said. "The road is dark," she said, "and you're welcome to the spare room." He knew this was simply practical. He also knew that it was something more than practical, not in any improper way, but in the way of two people who were not quite ready for the evening to close. He recognized the feeling because it had been a long time since he had felt it, and because it sat in his chest with an unfamiliar warmth. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You're not imposing," she said. "You're a man I'm planning to do business with, and it would be reckless to let you ride out in the dark when there's a perfectly good bed here." She paused. "Also, you still haven't told me what you thought about the second half of that book, and I have strong feelings about it that I would like to argue." He looked at her then in the fading light, and she looked back at him with that steady, tea-brown gaze, and he thought that he could not remember the last time he had wanted to keep talking to someone the way he wanted to keep talking to her. The feeling was so uncomplicated and so immediate that it almost alarmed him. "All right," he said. "Tell me your strong feelings." She did, and he argued back, and the porch light was lit by the time they were finished, and the stars over the Texas Panhandle were out in full, and it was somewhere past 10 o'clock, which was later than either of them had intended. She showed him to the spare room, which was plain and clean and smelled of cedar, and she said good night at the door with a kind of businesslike brevity that didn't quite conceal the fact that she was slightly flushed, which he noted and did not comment on. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the conversation, and about the way she laughed, and about the fact that he was going to have to finalize the cattle transaction tomorrow and ride back to Tascosa, and that after the cattle were transferred, there would be no natural reason to return. He found this thought to be significantly more troubling than it should have been, given that he had known the woman for approximately one afternoon. He was up before dawn, which was his habit, and he came out to the kitchen to find that Jennie was also already up, which did not surprise him even slightly. She was at the stove with her back to him when he came in, and she said without turning, "Coffee's ready," which told him she had heard him coming and had not startled, which told him something about her comfort with his presence that settled warmly in him. They had breakfast with Clara, who in the daylight was equally as direct as her mother, and had apparently decided that Abraham passed whatever internal evaluation she had been conducting the previous day. She told him about the horse she was going to have someday that would be better than Red Finn, even though she still loved Red Finn, and Abraham listened seriously and asked appropriate questions, and Jennie watched this from across the table with an expression she was doing her best to keep neutral. After breakfast, they finalized the terms of the sale over the kitchen table with the kind of clean efficiency that came from two people who were both straightforward and had both done this before. The price was $14 a head, exactly as agreed. The transfer date was set for 2 weeks out, which would give Abraham time to bring 3 more of his hands from Tascosa and provide Jennie's hands time to separate the 60 head for sale from the remainder of her breeding stock. Abraham wrote out a promissory note for the full amount, and Jennie looked it over with the careful attention of a woman who had learned never to assume that a document said what the person presenting it claimed it said. She did not apologize for the care with which she read it, and he did not expect her to. She handed it back and said, "This is satisfactory." "Good," he said. And then they both stood on opposite sides of the kitchen table with a completed transaction between them and nothing immediate left to discuss, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable so much as it was weighted with something that neither of them had named yet. "I'll ride back to Tascosa today," he said. "Yes," she said, "and return in 2 weeks with my men." "I'll have them ready for you," she said. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door and turned it in his hands for a moment, which was a habit he had when he was thinking and which he was not entirely aware of. "The book," he said. She looked at him. "I think," he said carefully, "that we didn't fully resolve the question about whether the ending was earned or whether it was convenient." "We did not," she agreed. "I think the ending was convenient and you think it was earned." "I think it was earned," he said, "but I acknowledge the argument against it is stronger than I initially gave it credit for." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that was nearly but not quite a smile. "That is a significant concession," she said. "I'm capable of them," he said. "Good to know," she said. He put his hat on and went to the door, and she walked with him to the porch, and he saddled his horse while she stood at the fence with her arms folded across the top rail, watching, and the morning was bright and cool and smelled of grass and dust, and the particular clarity of a day that had just started. He mounted up and turned the horse, and she looked up at him from the fence, and he said, 2 weeks. 2 weeks, she said. He rode out, and he did not look back until he was at the far end of the drive, and when he did, she was still there at the fence, watching him go. He thought about her the entire ride back to Tascosa, which was not something he had anticipated, and which he considered, rationally, to be some kind of mild insanity brought on by too little sleep and an unexpectedly stimulating conversation. He then stopped trying to be rational about it because rational had nothing to do with the way the morning light had looked on her face when she was arguing about a book, and rational had nothing to do with the particular quality of her laugh, and rational had nothing to do with the deep, uncomplicated rightness he had felt sitting on her porch in the dark talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. He realized somewhere between his 5th and 6th mile, in a great deal of trouble. The 2 weeks passed with the slow stubbornness of 2 weeks, that a person is waiting for something specific. Abraham managed his business in Tascosa, finalized his arrangements with his foreman Hector, checked the condition of the receiving pastures, and wrote 3 letters. 2 of them were business letters. The third was to Jennie Holloway, and it took him 4 attempts to write before he arrived at something that said what he intended without saying too much or too little. He wrote about the road conditions between Tascosa and the Holloway ranch, which were relevant to the cattle transfer. He wrote about an article he had read in a newspaper from Fort Worth about a survey of the region that he thought might interest her. He wrote about the question of the book ending, specifically a counterargument to her counterargument that he had been developing for several days with more investment than was strictly warranted. And then he wrote, simply and honestly, that he had thought about the conversation on the porch several times since returning and found himself hoping the 2 weeks would pass quickly. He sent it without letting himself read it a 5th time. Her reply arrived in 9 days, which was fast enough that he spent some time thinking about whether she had written it quickly or whether the mail route had simply cooperated. The letter was brisk and clear in the way she herself was, with none of the decorative hedging that he associated with correspondence that was trying to be polite rather than genuine. She addressed the road conditions with her own assessment. She said the Fort Worth article was interesting, and that she had a different interpretation of one of the survey conclusions, which she laid out in 2 precise paragraphs. She demolished his counterargument about the book ending with an efficiency that he found admirable even as it frustrated him. And at the end, in the same plain voice the rest of the letter was written in, she said that she had thought about the conversation on the porch as well, and that she was glad the 2 weeks were nearly finished. He read the letter twice and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, which was where he kept things he intended to keep. He rode back to the Holloway ranch on the appointed date with 3 of his hands and a string of spare horses, and when they came up the drive, Jennie was out in the yard speaking to Cody with the focused attention of someone finalizing a plan. She looked up when she heard the horses, and for just a moment, before she had arranged her expression into something more practical, He saw something open and warm in her face that went straight to the center of him. "Mr. Ramsey," she said. "Miss Holloway," he said. They shook hands over the fence with the formality of people who were very deliberately keeping things professional, and his hand fit around hers with a warmth that had no business being as significant as it felt. The transfer took the better part of 2 days. 60 head of longhorn cattle required careful sorting, documentation, and the management of various bovine opinions about being separated from their familiar pasture, and it was the kind of work that revealed a person's character with great clarity. Abraham's hands were good workers, competent and efficient. Cody and Pete were equally capable. And Jennie was in the thick of it the entire time, doing the work herself rather than directing it from a distance, which he had expected based on everything he already knew about her, and which still struck him with something like admiration every time he saw it. On the first evening of the transfer, they ate supper together again, the same group as before plus Abraham's 3 hands, and the conversation around the table had the ease of a group of people who were comfortable with the kind of work they were doing together. After supper, when the hands had retired and Clara had gone to bed, Abraham and Jennie ended up on the porch again, and it felt like returning to something rather than starting something, which was a feeling Abraham was aware he should probably examine more carefully than he was. "I got your letter," she said. "I got yours," he said. "The argument about the book ending was better in writing," she said. "I'll give you that." "It didn't change your position," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was better." He looked out at the dark land, and the stars were the kind of brilliant that only happened this far from any city, thick and crowded and absolutely indifferent to anything happening underneath them. "Can I ask you something direct?" he said. "You've been asking me direct things since you arrived," she said. "I haven't complained." "No," he said. "You haven't." He turned to look at her. She was watching him with that steady, careful gaze. "What is your life like?" he said. "Not the ranch, the life." She was quiet for a moment, and he felt the weight of the question settling between them. "Honest," she said. "Please," he said. "It is very full in the ways that keep a person from feeling sorry for themselves," she said. "The ranch takes everything I have to give it, and most days that's exactly what I want it to take. But the evenings are quiet, and the winters are long, and Clara misses having a father, which I can see in the way she talks to men who come to do business here, which is not something she does in the presence of other women the same way." She paused. "And there are conversations I want to have that there's no one here to have them with. Like the one we had on the porch," he said. "Like that one," she said quietly. He sat with that for a moment, not rushing it. "I've been on my own out here for 6 years," he said, repeating what he'd told her on the first day, but with a different weight behind it now. "I've built a good operation. I have work I'm proud of. I have a foreman I trust in hands who are reliable and a contract that will carry the business into solid ground." He looked at her. "And I can tell you exactly what I think about any stretch of land between here and Kansas, and I know 3 dozen cattle buyers by name, and I cannot tell you the last time I talked to someone the way I talked to you that first evening." She held his gaze steadily, the way she held most things, without flinching from it. "Abraham," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and the way she said it was careful and deliberate, like she had been thinking about it. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, "that I'd like to come back, not for cattle." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had something real in it, something that was being decided. "I have a daughter," she said. "I have a ranch that requires everything. I'm not a simple proposition." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm not asking for something simple." "What are you asking for?" she said. "To come back," he said, "and to see whether what I think is happening here is actually happening." She looked at him for a long moment. The night around them was full of the sounds of a ranch at rest, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the wind moving through the grass. And then she said, "I think it is." Something in him that had been pulled taut for a long time relaxed by a fraction. "All right then," he said. "All right," she said. He came back 3 weeks later on a Saturday with no business reason whatsoever. He brought a book, which he had found in a general store in Tascosa, and which he thought she would like based on everything he now knew about her reading preferences. He also brought a small wooden horse, painted red, which he had seen in the same store and had thought of Clara. Clara received the wooden horse with the gravity of a child who understood she was being acknowledged seriously, and placed it on the table next to her pencil drawing with the solemn deliberateness of someone curating a collection. Then she looked at Abraham and said, "Will you stay for supper?" "That's up to your mother," Abraham said. Clara looked at Jennie with a specific expression that was entirely too knowing for someone her age. Jennie looked at the ceiling briefly and then said, "Yes, he can stay for supper." He stayed for supper and well past it, and the porch conversation that evening moved through different territory than the previous ones. They talked about what he had built in Tascosa and what she had built here, and what each of them wanted the next 5 years to look like, and what they were afraid of, and what they were not afraid of, and he found that the list of things Jennie Holloway was not afraid of was extensive and specific and included things that surprised him in the best way. She was not afraid of hard winters. She was not afraid of having opinions in a county where a woman having opinions about the cattle market was considered unusual. She was not afraid of loneliness in the way some people were, the flinching kind of fear, though she disliked it. She was not afraid of being wrong. She was afraid of staying wrong, which he considered to be a meaningful distinction. What she was afraid of, she told him, was Clara growing up without the things a child needed that Jennie couldn't provide on her own. She was afraid of the ranch failing in a bad year and having nothing to leave her daughter. She was afraid of trusting too quickly and too completely, because she had done that once before with someone who turned out to be a better salesman than a partner, and the years of Thomas's illness had revealed things about the foundation of that marriage that she had preferred not to see while he was well. He listened to this without trying to talk her out of any of it, which he understood was what she needed more than reassurance. "That's a lot to carry," he said. "It doesn't feel like carrying," she said. "It feels like knowing. Carrying implies it's slowing me down. And it's not." "No," she said. "It just means I'm careful." "That seems right," he said. She looked at him with something that was not quite a question. "You're not going to tell me I don't need to be careful," she said. "No," he said. "You're right to be careful. I'm just hoping that at some point the careful consideration arrives at a reasonable conclusion." "And what conclusion is that?" she said. "That I'm not Thomas," he said, "and that what I'm offering is different." She was quiet for a long moment. "What are you offering, Abraham?" He thought about this carefully because she deserved a careful answer. "Honestly," he said, "I'm offering whatever you'll accept and whatever I can back up with action over time. I don't think making large promises at this stage is useful. I think what I can offer right now is consistent presence and honest behavior and the genuine intention of seeing where this goes." She sat with that. "That's a measured answer," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not objecting to it." He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. And by the fourth consecutive visit, Cody had started acknowledging him with a nod when he rode in that contained approximately 40% more warmth than the standard professional acknowledgement, which Abraham took as a significant endorsement from a man who did not waste expressions on people he hadn't assessed thoroughly. Clara had by this point moved from treating him with cautious approval to treating him with the cheerful imperiousness of a child who had decided someone was permanent before the adults had quite gotten there themselves. She showed him the progress of Red Finn's training, which was a project she had apparently been conducting independently, and which Red Finn had mixed feelings about. She showed him her growing collection of pencil drawings. She told him in complete seriousness that her teacher at the schoolhouse in town said she was advanced in arithmetic and that she planned to use this to her advantage in business when she grew up. "What kind of business?" Abraham asked. "I haven't decided," Clara said, "but it will involve horses." "That seems like a solid plan," he said. "I know," Clara said, and went back to her drawing. Jennie, who had been watching this exchange from the kitchen doorway, turned back to the stove with a very controlled expression that he was increasingly able to read as the way she looked when something was making her want to smile more than she thought she should. On the fifth visit, he brought her wildflowers that he had found growing along the road, and had stopped to cut with his pocket knife with a self-consciousness that he was glad no one had witnessed. He handed them to her when he dismounted and said, these were growing along the road and seemed like a waste to leave, which was not his finest performance of casual indifference, and she received them with a gravity that was also not entirely convincing. "Thank you," she said. "I'll put them in water." "You do that," he said. That evening, he helped her mend a section of fence that Cody had been meaning to get to, but hadn't, and they worked side by side in the fading afternoon with a comfortable efficiency that came from two people who were both capable and who didn't get in each other's way. He handed her the wire stretcher when she needed it without being asked. She handed him the pliers with the same uncalculated ease. When they were done, they leaned against the repaired fence and looked at it with the satisfaction of people who had fixed something that needed fixing. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "I find working with my hands clarifying." "Clarifying," she said, turning the word over. "What does it clarify?" "Thinking," he said, "about things." "What things?" she said. He looked at her. She was looking back at him in the particular way she had that was both direct and slightly careful, and the afternoon light was on her face in a way that did something to his ability to formulate words efficiently. "You," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked out at the pasture, and then she looked back at him, and then she said, quietly and without any of the careful reserve she usually maintained, "Abraham." "Yes," he said. "I would like it very much," she said, "if you kissed me." He had thought about this. He had thought about it more than he had thought about most things in recent weeks, which was saying something given the number of practical business considerations he had active at any given time. He had thought about it with the deliberate, honorable restraint of a man who did not want to move faster than was right, and who understood that there were real stakes here. A woman who had been careful with herself for good reason. A child who was watching and learning what relationships between adults looked like. A history that needed to be respected. And then she said that, and all of the deliberate, honorable restraint resolved itself into a single clear moment. He stepped toward her and took her face in both hands with a gentleness that he meant entirely, and she looked up at him with those tea-brown eyes, and he kissed her. And it was everything he had thought it would be, which was not the usual outcome of anything a person spent significant time thinking about, and it was also something he hadn't thought about, which was the feeling of rightness, of two things that fit together settling into place. She kissed him back with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything, and when they stepped back, her face had a warmth to it that he had not seen before, a full and undisguised warmth, and she was smiling in a way that reached her eyes completely and was nothing like the controlled near smile she usually allowed herself. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've been thinking about that for some time," she said. "So have I," he said. "I suspected," she said. "You're perceptive," he said. "About most things," she said. He took her hand, which was capable and calloused from real work, and she let him, and they stood there by the mended fence in the last gold of the afternoon, and it was the kind of moment that a person remembers with total clarity for the rest of their life. Summer came on with the particular ferocity of a Texas Panhandle summer, which took no gradual approach, but arrived with heat and wind, and the requirement that every creature on the land adjust or suffer. Abraham continued to ride out from Tascosa every week, and sometimes more than once a week, and the long rides in the heat did not bother him in the way they might have bothered someone less accustomed to the physical demands of this country, because the destination was worth whatever the road cost. Jennie was running the ranch through its busiest season, and he rode alongside that work rather than expecting to be separate from it. He helped with what he could legitimately be useful for without overstepping into the management of something that was hers, which was a line he was careful about because he understood that the ranch was not just her livelihood but her identity and her proof. And a man who rode in and started changing how things were run would not be the kind of man she had any use for. She talked to him about her concerns, which was different from asking for his opinion, and he understood the difference. When she mentioned that the feed prices had gone up and she was recalculating her costs for the season, he listened without offering solutions she hadn't asked for. When she told him she was considering expanding the breeding operation by 2 more bulls over the next 2 years, he asked questions that helped her think it through rather than telling her what he thought she should do. She noticed this because she noticed everything, and one evening she said, "You're very careful about not telling me what to do." "It's your ranch," he said. "A lot of men wouldn't see it that way," she said. "A lot of men would be wrong," he said. She looked at him in the careful, measuring way she sometimes still had, as though she was finding the edges of who he actually was. "Thomas wasn't a bad man," she said, "but he thought my opinions about the ranch were a kind of helpfulness that existed in the absence of his guidance. When he was too sick to guide, he was frustrated by the fact that things ran perfectly well." She said it without bitterness, just with the clarity of someone who had looked at something and seen it truly. "I don't want that again." "I understand," he said, "and I won't offer you that." "I know," she said, and the way she said it had moved past the testing of it into the believing of it, which was different and more significant. His business in Tascosa was going well. The herd he had assembled, including Jennie's 60 head, was filling the pastures satisfactorily, and his foreman Hector had the operation running with the competent quietness of a well-organized machine. The Kansas contract was on track for September. He was making money in the steady, accumulating way that he preferred, not dramatically, but reliably, and the operation he had spent 6 years building was arriving at something that felt like real solidity. He was also, for the first time in those 6 years, thinking seriously about what the operation would look like with another person beside him in it. Not as a business calculation, but as the natural extension of something he wanted. He was thinking about this on a hot July afternoon while riding the fence line of his east pasture with Hector, who was a man of Comanche and Mexican heritage, compact and extraordinarily capable, who had been with Abraham for 4 years, and who had a quiet intelligence about most things, including people. "You're distracted," Hector said. "I'm thinking," Abraham said. "About what you're thinking about every time you ride out to the Holloway ranch," Hector said without any inflection. Abraham looked at him. "Am I that obvious?" "You come back different every time," Hector said. "Not bad different, just different." Abraham looked out at the cattle moving in the heat shimmer of the afternoon. "She's something," he said, which was not an eloquent summation of anything, but Hector nodded in the way of a man who understood exactly what was meant. "What's the plan?" Hector asked. "I'm working on it," Abraham said. "You're going to ask her," Hector said. It was not a question. "If she'll have me," Abraham said. "She will," Hector said with the simple certainty of a man who did not say things without reason. "You don't know her," Abraham said. "I know you," Hector said. "And you're not a person that someone who has any sense turns away from." He paused. "Also, you've been riding 6 hours round trip to see a woman every week for 3 months. If she wasn't interested, she would have told you by now. She seems like she would do that." "She would absolutely do that," Abraham agreed. In August, Jennie's sister Miriam came up from Tennessee for a visit that had been planned for months, and which Jennie had mentioned several times with a mixture of genuine anticipation and the mild apprehension of a person who loved their sibling and also found them somewhat exhausting. Miriam Ashworth was 33, pretty in a softer way than Jennie, and arrived with 3 trunks and a definite set of opinions about Texas, none of which were positive. She revised several of her opinions about Texas within the first hour of meeting Abraham. "He's not what I expected," she told Jennie in a stage whisper in the kitchen that was not quite private enough, and Abraham on the porch elected not to indicate that he had heard. "What did you expect?" Jennie asked with the tone of a woman who had anticipated this conversation. Someone rougher, Miriam said. Less thoughtful looking, more. She lowered her voice further, but Abraham's hearing was good, dramatic. This is not a theatrical production, Jennie said. I know, Miriam said, but I had imagined a cowboy. He is a cowboy, Jennie said, with a dry precision that made Abraham smile privately. He's very quiet, Miriam said. He thinks, Jennie said. It's what the quiet is. There was a brief pause, and then Miriam said, in a different tone entirely, Jennie, you're in love with him. And Jennie said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and Abraham sat very still on the porch and felt something enormous and uncomplicated move through him. Miriam stayed 2 weeks and came around to the Texas Panhandle with a speed that was probably related to the fact that Jennie's happiness was visible in a way that Miriam had clearly been hoping to see for some time. She was loud and warm and told stories about their childhood in Tennessee that made Jennie roll her eyes with genuine affection, and she was excellent with Clara, who received her aunt's attention with the delight of a child who was not spoiled, but who liked being paid attention to by someone who was cheerfully invested. On the evening before Miriam was due to leave, she cornered Abraham on the porch with the unapologetic directness of a woman who felt she had earned the right. I'm going to ask you something forward, she said. All right, Abraham said. What are your intentions, she said, toward my sister? He looked at her steadily. Honest and long-term, he said. She studied him. She told me you don't make large promises, she said. I don't, he said, but when I make a promise, I mean it completely. Are you planning to make one, she said. Yes, he said. Miriam looked at him for a long moment and then nodded, a single firm nod the way Jennie herself nodded when she had concluded something. Good, she said. She deserves someone who means it completely. I know she does, he said. Miriam went home to Tennessee with her 3 trunks and left behind an impression of energy and warmth, and a very clear indication to anyone watching that she approved. September came and the Kansas contract delivered, and Abraham's operation turned its first major profit, which was the kind of concrete, tangible success that he had been working toward for 6 years, and which settled into him with a quiet satisfaction that was profound. He paid his hands well, gave Hector a bonus that Hector received with the dignified gravity of a man who had earned it and knew it, and looked at his books and his pastures and his operation and thought, this is real. This works. And then he thought about Jennie, as he did with increasing regularity and decreasing ability to think about anything else for extended periods. He rode to the Holloway ranch on a Saturday in late September when the air had turned cool, and the grass had gone golden, and the sky was the deep blue that only appeared in Texas in the fall. And Jennie came out to meet him as she always did, and Clara ran across the yard from wherever she had been to throw herself at his horse with her customary lack of self-consciousness, and he thought, this is what I want the rest of my life to look like. He spent the day in the comfortable rhythm that their visits had developed, which included some work because there was always work, and conversation that moved as it always did through things that mattered, and supper with Clara and the porch in the evening. And then Clara went to bed, and the night settled around them in the way it did, and Abraham turned to Jennie and said, I need to say something. She looked at him with the steady attention she gave to things she understood were important. Say it, she said. He had thought about how to say this. He had rejected several versions that were too elaborate and several that were too bare. He had arrived at something that he thought was honest. I came to your ranch in April to buy cattle, he said. And I have thought about that afternoon, the first afternoon, approximately every day since it happened. Not in a way I can explain purely in terms of the conversation, though the conversation was remarkable. He paused. In a way that I can only explain by saying that I recognize something. That I sat in your kitchen and looked at you and thought, this person makes sense to me in a way that no one has before. She was very still. I've been showing up every week, he said, because I didn't want to be away. And I've been thinking for some time now that what I want is to not be away at all. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, small and plain with a single dark red stone, which he had bought in Amarillo from a jeweler who had had exactly one ring that he thought suited the person he was buying it for. "I am not interested in changing anything that's yours," he said. "The ranch is yours. Clara is yours. What you've built here is yours, and I would not presume to step into the center of it. But I would like to be beside it, beside you, if you'll have me." She looked at the ring in his hand, and then she looked at his face, and her own face was doing something that she was not, for once, trying to control. It was open and full and warm, and something he had never seen quite at this volume before, and it took his breath away with a directness that nothing had quite managed to do in 31 years. "Abraham Ramsey," she said, and her voice had something rough and honest at the edges of it. "You came to buy my cattle." "I did," he said. "And you stayed because the conversation was too good to end at sunset," she said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what happened." She looked at him for one more moment, and then she said, "Yes." The word arrived in him like something coming home. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it on her hand with an expression that was trying to be practical and absolutely failing. And then he took her hand in both of his, and she leaned forward and kissed him with a warmth and directness that matched everything else about her. And the night was cool, and the stars were overhead, and the land stretched out in every direction with its vast and stubborn indifference. And none of that indifference touched what was happening on the porch of the Holloway ranch at all. Clara was told in the morning, which was a conversation that Abraham and Jennie had both thought carefully about, and Clara listened with the grave attention she brought to important things, and then she looked at Abraham and said, "So you'll live here?" "If that suits you," Abraham said. Clara considered this. "Redfin likes you," she said, as though this were the conclusive factor. "I'm glad," Abraham said with complete seriousness. Clara nodded. "All right then," she said, which was so precisely her mother's manner of concluding something that Jennie had to look at the window. The practical questions were considerable and required practical answers, which suited both of them. The ranch was Jennie's and would remain Jennie's. She was clear about this, and Abraham was equally clear that this was as it should be. He had his own operation in Tascosa, which Hector was more than capable of managing with the level of autonomy Abraham trusted him to have. The plan that emerged from several long and honest conversations was that Abraham would divide his time between the two operations for the first year, moving his center of operations gradually toward the Holloway ranch as the situation allowed, and that the two properties might eventually be run in coordination rather than in competition with each other's claims on his time. Hector, when informed of the engagement, said, "Good," and then, "I told you she would," and then returned to his fence inspection without further comment, which was the fullest possible expression of approval from a man of his particular nature. The wedding was in November because they saw no reason to wait a long time, and because November on the Texas Panhandle was cold but not yet brutal, and because Jennie said that she was 37, which was not actually her age. She was 27, and she said it with deliberate exaggeration to make him laugh, which he did. "You're 27, he said, "and you're going to remember that every time you try to be expedient." "I'm expedient by nature," she said. "I've noticed," he said. The wedding was small and exactly what they both wanted, which was to say it was not small in heart, but it was uncomplicated in form. They were married in the small white church in the town of Brealey, which was the nearest town of any significance to the Holloway ranch, by a preacher named Hodges who had married several generations of families in the county, and who conducted ceremonies with a warm solemnity that made them feel like they meant something, which they did. Miriam came back from Tennessee, this time with only one trunk, which was either restraint or advance planning for a longer stay, and she sat in the front pew next to Clara and cried with the open generosity of a woman who was very glad for her sister and had no intention of hiding it. Clara watched the proceedings with enormous seriousness and held her aunt's hand and did not cry, which was very like her. But afterward, When Abraham knelt down to her level outside the church, she put her arms around his neck with a directness and force that told him everything about how she actually felt. He held her and looked over her head at Jennie, who was watching them with that warm, open, undefended expression that he was coming to understand was the face she wore when something had reached the part of her that she protected most carefully, and he thought that he was going to spend a very long time making sure she had reasons to wear it. Hector had come from Tascosa for the wedding, which meant more than it was easy to say, given the distance and the fact that Hector did not travel without significant reason. He stood in the back of the church with his hat in his hands and nodded at Abraham when their eyes met across the room with a nod that contained, Abraham thought, approximately a decade's worth of feeling compressed into a single economical gesture. They ate at the hotel in Brealey, which had a dining room that was adequate and a cook who had made a real effort, and Miriam gave a toast that was funny and genuine and made Jennie look at her with the particular exasperation and love of a person who cannot believe their sibling is doing this and is also deeply glad for it. Cody and Pete had come in from the ranch, both in their best shirts, and sat at the table with the contained pleasure of men who had watched something developing and were glad to see it arrive. And then they went home, which was the Holloway ranch, which was now in some real and significant sense Abraham's home as well, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars were as they always were over the Panhandle, enormous and completely serious, and they stood on the porch together in the quiet dark, shoulder to shoulder, and looked out at the land. "Well," Jennie said. "Yes," Abraham said. "We've done it," she said. "We have," he said. "How do you feel?" she asked. He looked at her in the dark, in the cold November air, with her breath making small clouds and the ring on her hand catching the faint light from the window behind them. "Like someone who has arrived somewhere they're supposed to be," he said. She looked back at him with those amber-brown eyes, and then she turned toward him fully and put her hands on his chest in the way of a woman who was now allowed to do that without calculation, openly and without reserve, and said, "Good, because you are." Winter on the Texas Panhandle that year was the hardest kind, which is to say it was exactly as hard as anyone who had lived through a Panhandle winter knew it could be. The cold came with wind that had nothing between it and whatever it was blowing toward, no mountains, no forests, just the flat, insistent land and the sky above it and the wind doing what it wanted. It drove the temperature down in the first week of December to something that tested every fence, every water trough, every feed supply, and every creature on the property. Abraham had arranged before winter to bring additional feed stores from Tascosa, a decision that Jennie had not asked for but had agreed was prudent when he mentioned it. The preparation made the difference through 2 severe cold spells in January that left them housebound for days at a stretch, which sounded worse than it was, because being housebound with Jennie was not a hardship Abraham had any trouble enduring. They read. They talked. They played card games with Clara, who had an aptitude for cards that was either a gift or a warning. It was impossible to know which yet. They did the necessary indoor work. They had long conversations about the ranch's future, about Abraham's Tascosa operation, about what they wanted the next several years to look like. And the conversations were always good in the way that conversations between two people who genuinely think together are good, productive and clear and honest without ever becoming cold. One January evening, deep in the worst of the winter, with the wind making its case loudly against the windows, and the stove putting out the heat of something that meant business, Jennie sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open, and Abraham sat across from her with a letter from Hector that described the condition of the Tascosa operation, and Clara was asleep, and the house was warm, and there was coffee. And Abraham looked up from Hector's letter at Jennie bent over her ledger with her pencil moving and her hair falling out of its pin again as it always did by this hour, and he thought, this is every evening. This is what every evening looks like. And the thought had so much warmth in it that it was almost physical, "What?" Jennie said without looking up. "Nothing," he said. She looked up. She looked at him with that careful attention she had, and then her expression shifted into something warmer. "You're doing that thing," she said. "What thing?" he said. "The quiet thinking thing that's actually not that quiet," she said. "I was thinking about the evening," he said. "About the fact that this is it." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked around the kitchen, the warm light, the stove, the ledger, the coffee, the wind outside and the stillness inside, and she said, "Yes, this is it." "Is it what you wanted?" he said. She put down her pencil and folded her hands on the ledger and gave him the full, direct attention she gave to things she wanted to answer properly. "I wanted," she said, "to not be alone with everything I know and everything I care about. I wanted someone who could match what I bring. I wanted Clara to see what a real partnership looks like." She paused. "You are all of those things, Abraham." He sat with that for a long moment and then said, "You're everything I didn't know to hope for. And I want to be clear that I understood hope before you, but it was a smaller word." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she stood up from her side of the table and came around to his side and sat down beside him, close and deliberate. And he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him with the settled ease of something that was not new anymore, but was also not diminished by being familiar. And they sat like that in the warm kitchen with the winter making its noise outside, and everything they had chosen being entirely contained within the walls around them. Spring came again, the second spring since that first afternoon when he had ridden up the drive and she had come out to meet him. And it came with the particular sense of renewal that the Panhandle spring always delivered after a hard winter, green and determined, and full of the smell of wet grass and warming earth. The cattle came through the winter well, which was the result of the combined preparation of two people who knew what they were doing, and the calving season was strong, with more live births and healthy animals than the previous year. Jennie told Abraham she was expecting a child in March. In the plain, direct way she announced most significant things. In the evening after supper when Clara was doing her schoolwork, and the kitchen was warm and quiet. She said it looking at him with the careful, watchful expression of someone who was genuinely uncertain of a response for once, which was rare enough to be striking. He sat very still for a moment, and then he stood up from the table and crossed to where she was standing and took both her hands in his and said, "Jennie." "Yes," she said. "That is the best thing you have ever told me," he said. "And you have told me a great deal of excellent things." She laughed, fully and without control, and then she was against his chest and his arms were around her, and she held on with a strength that told him she had been more uncertain about the telling than she had let on. And he held her back with the same strength and said quietly into her hair, "We're going to be all right. Everything is going to be all right." "I know," she said, which was her way of saying she believed it. Clara took the news with the same considered gravity she applied to important developments, and then said she hoped it was a boy because boys were less complicated in her experience, which made both Abraham and Jennie laugh for separate reasons. The boy was born in November, almost exactly a year after their wedding, which Abraham thought was a neatness that felt almost intentional. He was named Thomas William Ramsey, Thomas for Jennie's first husband, because she said it was right to honor that, and William for Abraham's father, because it was equally right to honor that. And Abraham agreed to both without hesitation, because he understood that building a life together didn't mean erasing what had come before. Thomas William was a large, loudly opinionated infant who had a grip like a small vice, and a set of lungs that made an argument against the idea that he lacked opinions. He had Abraham's coloring and Jennie's expression, or at least he had the expression she wore when she had decided something, and was not open to alternatives, which appeared on her son's face within the first 12 hours of his life and never really left. Clara took her role as older sister with a seriousness that was entirely characteristic. She established, within the first week, a set of protocols around Thomas Williams' schedule that she felt were more efficient than the ones currently being employed, and she communicated these to both parents with the calm authority of someone who had clearly thought this through. Abraham looked at Jennie over Clara's head during this briefing with an expression that Jennie met with her controlled, not-quite smile. And later, when Clara had gone to bed, they sat together with Thomas William between them, and they were both laughing quietly in the way of two people who found the same things funny, which was one of the things Abraham considered among the great gifts of his life. Hector came from Tascosa in December to see the baby, which he did with the careful formality of a man who was not naturally at ease with infants, but who had clearly decided this visit was important. He held Thomas William with the concentration of someone handling something both precious and unpredictable, and the baby stared up at him with Jennie's direct, tea-brown gaze, and neither of them blinked for an extended moment. "He's good," Hector said, which was, from Hector, roughly equivalent to a formal declaration. "He is," Abraham agreed. Abraham had spent the year gradually integrating his Tascosa operation into the larger structure of the combined ranch. Hector had been given a partner in the management, a steady man named Dalton who had worked his way up from hand to a position of real responsibility, and the two of them together ran the Tascosa property with an independence that freed Abraham to be primarily at the Holloway ranch, without the operation suffering for his absence. He still rode to Tascosa every 2 or 3 weeks to handle things that genuinely required him, and Jennie sometimes rode with him on those visits, which she approached with the same interested assessment she brought to everything, looking at his operation with the careful eye of someone who understood operations and could evaluate one fairly. "Hector is remarkable," she said on the first visit, watching him direct the evening work from the far fence. "He is," Abraham said. "He's the reason the Tascosa property works." "Have you told him that?" she said. "Yes," Abraham said. She nodded, approving. The second year of their marriage went by with the particular quality of time that passes while a person is fully occupied with something they love, which is to say it went both quickly and deeply, leaving more behind it than time that passes in waiting ever does. There were good months and difficult months, as there always were in a business that depended on weather and animals and markets that shifted without warning. There was a drought scare in the summer that resolved before it became a genuine crisis, but that cost 3 weeks of worried attention and careful management. There was a dispute with a neighboring property about a shared water source that Jennie navigated with such precise and unyielding clarity that the neighbor, a man named Warren Briggs, who had expected to find her easier to manage than her late husband, retreated from the negotiation with the look of a man who had met a more formidable opponent than anticipated. Abraham had stood beside her during that negotiation, which had happened on the mutual property line with all the weight of the Texas sun pressing down on everyone present, and had not said a word that she did not ask him to say, because she did not need him to, and because watching her was genuinely one of the finest things he had experienced in his adult life. When Briggs and his men had ridden off, she turned to Abraham and said, "Well, excellent," he said. "He'll try again," she said. "Probably," he said, "but he'll remember this." "He will," she said, with a confidence that was not boastful but was entirely grounded. Clara turned 10 and then 11, and continued her general program of being more organized and certain about most things than the adults around her, including her ambitions, which remained horse-related, and had acquired enough specificity to include, by her 11th birthday, a plan for breeding a line of ranch horses that she had worked out in considerable detail, and which Abraham read when she showed it to him, with the genuine respect of a businessman who recognized a sound plan when he saw one. "This is good, Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you help me start it?" "When you're old enough to manage it properly," he said, "and if your mother agrees." "I'll be 12 in February," Clara said. "That's not far." "It's not," he agreed. She went to present the plan to Jennie with the momentum of someone who had just secured a first vote and was now working on the second. The third spring came, and with it a lightness that had been building through the winter like something underground, growing toward its moment. The ranch was thriving in the measurable way of ledgers that balanced and animals that were healthy and hands who were paid on time and who stayed, which was the real evidence of an operation that worked. Abraham's combined operations, the Holloway Ranch and Tascosa together, were producing enough that he was being approached by other buyers in the county who wanted to work with him, and he was selective about which ones he said yes to, because being selective was how he had built something worth protecting. Jennie was, in that third spring, visibly happy in a way that she no longer tried to contain or manage. It was not that she had been unhappy before, she hadn't, but there had always been a layer of careful reserve, a habit of keeping a portion of herself held back, which came from experience and intelligence, and the entirely reasonable caution of a woman who had learned that the world did not always behave as it should toward people who offered it everything they had. That layer had been dissolving steadily since the fall he had proposed, and by that third spring it was simply gone, and what was there instead was her, full and direct and warm and entirely present in her own life. He noticed it. He said so. "You seem happy," he said, on a March morning when the air had the particular sweetness of early spring, and the cattle were moving through the new grass with slow contentment. She looked at him from where she stood at the fence, watching the pasture. "I am," she said simply. "Good," he said. "You're responsible for a significant portion of it," she said, without looking at him, which was how she said things she considered large enough to be slightly embarrassed by. He moved to stand beside her at the fence and looked out at the cattle too and said, "You're responsible for the entirety of mine." She looked at him sideways. "That seems like an overstatement." "It's not," he said. "I built things out here because I knew how to build things, but I didn't know what I was building them for until I rode up your drive to buy cattle." She held his gaze for a moment and then she said, "You had a very good reason to stay past sunset." "The best reason there is," he said. "Conversation worth having." She smiled then, full and real and warm, and leaned against him at the fence rail, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they looked out together at the land they were both responsible for, the cattle and the grass and the sky and the work of it, and the life they had made inside all of it. Thomas William, at 2 years old, was conducting his own investigations of the world with the energy of a small person who had determined that most things existed specifically for him to engage with directly. He had his father's steadiness in certain foundational ways and his mother's directness in all others, and he followed Clara around the yard with the devotion of a younger sibling who recognized genuine competence and admired it unconditionally. Clara bore this with a grace that was partly real and partly performed, but the affection in it was entirely genuine. Red Finn, the ranch horse who had been Clara's particular favorite since before Abraham had arrived, had become old enough to be retired from heavy work, which was a moment that Clara managed with considerably more fortitude than anyone had expected. She was the one who proposed that Red Finn be kept on the property in a gentler role, which Jennie agreed to without hesitation, because she understood what Red Finn meant in Clara's personal history, and because she respected her daughter's feelings about the things that mattered to her. Clara had by this time acquired 2 young horses of her own, both of which had been carefully selected in consultation with Abraham and Cody, and which were the beginning of the breeding program she had planned with such precision at age 10. Abraham had helped her start it at 12 as promised, and the early results were promising in ways that even Cody, who was not given to optimism about untested ideas, admitted were impressive. Jennie told Abraham about a second pregnancy in the fall of Thomas Williams' second year, again in the evening, again at the kitchen table, but this time without the cautious uncertainty of the first announcement. She simply said, "There's going to be another one," and Abraham looked up from what he was reading and said, "When?" And she told him, and he came around the table and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then properly. And Thomas William, who was at this point capable of walking into any room at will, wandered in from wherever he had been and stood in the doorway and watched his parents with the expression of a 2-year-old who was not entirely sure about whatever was happening, but was prepared to investigate. The second child was a girl born in the spring, named Mary Ellen Ramsey, after Jennie's mother and Abraham's grandmother, which satisfied both of them completely. She arrived in the world with considerably less of her brother's volume and considerably more of his sister's air of considered assessment, looking at the people around her with an expression of mild but attentive interest from the first hour. Clara appointed herself chief authority on what Mary Ellen required, a position she occupied with the same thorough conviction she brought to everything, and Abraham watched his 3 children and his wife in the kitchen on a spring morning, and felt something that was beyond the language of most things he had been trained to use. There were 4 of them now, with all the complications and beauties that entailed. Clara, clear-eyed and capable and already more herself than most adults managed to become. Thomas William, 2½ and magnificently committed to everything he wanted. Mary Ellen, new and particular and already somehow completely present. And Jennie, who was the ground all of it stood on and the light that made it visible, who was everything she had been and more of it now, her laughter fuller, her certainty warmer, her quiet moments more peaceful. He was sitting on the porch one evening in May, that first May of Mary Ellen's life, when Jennie came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee in the way she always did, setting one at his elbow without ceremony, and the evening was warm and the grass was green and the cattle were moving slowly in the distant pasture and the light was going gold and long across everything. Clara told Thomas William today, Jennie said, that he needs to learn to be gentler with the baby. How did he receive that? Abraham said, with complete incomprehension, Jennie said, but she's working on it. She always does, he said. She's remarkable, Jennie said, with the pride of a mother who had watched her child become herself. She is, he agreed. She has her mother's way of arriving at a thing completely. Jennie looked at him. You say things like that and I still never know what to do with them. You don't need to do anything with them, he said. They're just true. She looked out at the evening and then she said, with the quietness of someone thinking something through as they said it, Abraham, are you happy, truly? The question had enough weight in it to deserve a real answer, rather than an easy one. He looked at the land in front of them, the land he had ridden up to for business and had never quite ridden away from, the land that had turned out to contain everything he had not known he was looking for. He looked at the house behind them, where 3 children were in various stages of settling for the night, where the kitchen was warm and the books were on the shelf, and the ledger was on the table, and the coffee was on the stove. He looked at the woman beside him, who had come out of her house 3 years ago to meet a stranger who had come to buy her cattle and had not told him to hurry up and finish his business, who had asked him in for coffee first, who had argued about a book on a porch in the dark until neither of them wanted the argument to end. Jennie, he said. Yes, she said. I came to buy your cattle, he said. You did, she said. And I stayed because the conversation was too good to end at sunset. Yes, she said. And everything I have that is real and good and worth the having, he said, came from that decision to stay. She looked at him for a long moment with those amber-brown eyes, and then she reached over and took his hand the way she did, without ceremony, the way of a person to whom the gesture was as natural as breathing now, and she held it, and the evening went long and gold across the land, and the stars were beginning to appear at the edge of the sky in the east, one by one as they always did, and the windmill turned in the slow breeze, and somewhere out in the pasture, a cow called once and was answered. And the Holloway ranch, which was also the Ramsey ranch now in all the ways that mattered, held all of them inside its fences and its fields and its particular, irreplaceable life. You're the best thing that ever came to buy cattle, Jennie said, which was not how she usually spoke. It was softer and more open than her usual manner, and he knew what it cost her in terms of the careful management she had practiced for so many years, and he understood it as the gift it was. "And you," he said, "are the best reason in this world to stay past sunset." She squeezed his hand once, firm and certain, and they sat together in the evening that neither of them was in any hurry to see end. And the stars came up the way they always did out here, one by one and then all at once, filling the sky from edge to edge with everything they had been offering to anyone patient enough to wait for the dark. The years that followed were built on that foundation, day by day in the way that real things are built, not with grand gestures, but with the accumulation of 10,000 ordinary moments that turned out to be extraordinary in the having of them. Good years and harder years, seasons that cooperated and seasons that did not, but through all of it the same essential truth holding. Two people who had found each other across a transaction that was supposed to be simple, who had recognized something in the other that they had not known to look for, and who had had the good sense to keep talking past sunset. Clara grew into exactly the person she had always been becoming, with a ranch horse breeding operation by the time she was 15 that Cody called the most sensible thing on the property, and an arithmetic ability that her teacher in town had long since exhausted the capacity to teach. She was her mother's daughter in every essential quality, and had acquired from Abraham a particular patience with numbers that made her laugh, and say she would have to give him credit for that one. Thomas William grew up with his father's steadiness and his mother's certainty, and turned out to be the kind of boy who made ranching look like something he had invented personally, which was an attitude his father recognized and did not discourage. Mary Ellen grew into the quietest of the three, with the most unnerving perceptiveness, capable of watching a room for 10 minutes and then making a single observation that was so accurate it temporarily silenced everyone present, which was a quality both her parents recognized and regarded with a mixture of pride and mild apprehension. Hector came for Christmas most years when the road allowed it, and he became over time less a guest than a fixture at the table, which was exactly right. Cody retired eventually to a small place in town that he had been saving toward for 20 years, and Pete became the senior hand and ran the practical work of the ranch with the same quiet efficiency Cody had always brought to it. Miriam visited from Tennessee every year or two, still with entirely too many trunks, still with entirely too many opinions, and still completely welcome. Abraham wrote to his mother in Missouri every month without fail, and she wrote back with the regularity of a woman who had decided her son had found what he needed, and was not going to stop reminding him that she knew this. She made the journey west once, in the summer of Mary Ellen's 3rd year, and sat on the porch with Jennie for an entire afternoon in what appeared to be a conversation of significant depth that Abraham was given almost no details about afterward, and she went home having said to Abraham only, "She's exactly right," which he took as the highest endorsement available from that particular source. And at the end of every day, which was the measure of it, they came back to each other. To the porch and the coffee and the conversation that had started on a spring afternoon in 1878, when a man had come to buy 60 head of longhorn cattle, and a woman had come out of her house to meet him, and neither of them had known that what was actually beginning was the rest of their lives. The conversation never did end at sunset. It kept going, past dark and into the years, through everything the land and the life threw at it, growing deeper and easier and more itself as time went on. It was, Abraham thought, the best conversation he had ever had, and he intended to keep having it for as long as he was given time to have it. Jennie would have said the same, and said it plainly, because that was how she said most things that mattered, plainly and without excess, in the clear, direct voice that he had first heard across a ranch yard on a morning that had started as business and become something else entirely. She had come out to meet a stranger who had written a letter about her cattle. He had come with a promissory note and a fair price and no expectation of anything beyond a transaction. And then she had said, "Coffee first," And he had said yes, and the rest of it had followed from that, as naturally and inevitably as a Texas spring following a hard winter, which was to say, not easily or without difficulty, but absolutely and completely, with the kind of settled permanence that good country and good people produced when they were given the time, and the light they needed to grow into what they were always meant to be.